What would you do if a stranger returned something you thought represented everything you owned, and inside it there was a single line of paper that upended your entire understanding of what mattered? It began with a wallet and a note and ended with a choice that would change two lives and a neighborhood. Jane Morales, a 28-year-old barista who worked mornings at a small bakery that smelled of butter and yeast, had no idea she was about to walk into a story that would test honesty, promise, and the weight of small acts. On the other side of town, Marcus Caldwell, a billionaire in his early 40s who lived in a glass penthouse with city lights as his wallpaper, had never been stopped by hunger or doubt. He had not known what longing felt like for years. A rainy morning would force both of them into a collision that neither expected. Stay with us, because by the end, you will see rescue and reconciliation in a way that does not fit the headlines. And you may find yourself asking what you would do if faced with the same choice. The city smelled of coffee and wet stone. There was a distant siren and the steady tap of rain against a bakery window. Prepare to feel surprised and softly moved. Jane opened the bakery before dawn, doing what she had done every day for 5 years. Her hands knew the weight of dough, her shoulders remembered the long pull of the oven door, and her throat kept a quiet catalog of all the names regulars asked for. The shop was a narrow room with a brass bell over the door and a counter scarred by rolling pins. The paint a little chipped where customers had brushed shoulders 100 times. Maria, owner of the bakery, had a laugh that filled the corner, and a dog named Rosa who slept by the flour sacks. Jane lived 2 blocks away, above a thrift store in a small apartment where the curtains were threads of sun and shadow. She had gone to culinary school for a season, then left because bills kept getting louder than dreams. She earned tips by knowing each patron. By habit, she remembered how Luis, a boy from the block, liked extra butter, and how old Mr. Thomas preferred his coffee black and steaming. At night, Jane read by the hum of the fridge, thinking of a future that kept dissolving into the next month's rent. She kept a small jar by the window for spare coins, called Hope, and sometimes a stranger would drop $1 in and say, "Keep it." Those coins and quiet hands were what she had to offer the city. Marcus Caldwell owned half a storefront in the financial district without ever having stepped foot inside a small bakery until the day his schedule made him late and a cab left him under rain. The penthouse he called a home looked down on streets that seemed to move in miniature. He had staff who measured the temperature of his coffee and assistants who blocked interruption like a shield. He began mornings with a list of acquisitions and calls with people who treated his voice like a currency. There was a portrait in his hallway that showed him smiling at 30, a smile he rarely felt now. He slept in a bed wide enough for dreams he did not keep. Money had given him a kind of freedom, but not the quiet human answers that come from being known. It had not taught him how to carry small obligations or to let a city teach him. When the rain made the city honest and slippery, he stepped into the warm glow of a corner bakery because there was a brief hunger for something unregulated, a private small pleasure. It was mid-morning when the wallet fell out from the inner pocket of Marcus's coat. He did not notice until he was halfway up the avenue, and a woman in a gray overcoat called out the brand, and he felt the cold hole where identity had been. A wallet is more than leather. It keeps the small evidence of life, the receipts, coffee rewards, the photos, and a note from a child. The shape of loss in that moment was not about money, but an unraveling of routine. Jane found the wallet later that day, lying on the stoop outside the bakery, damp and sticky with rain. She picked it up with 2 hands because it felt heavy and because inside of it lay a folded piece of lined paper. There was no panic, only a careful inspection. She smelled leather, rain, and the faint cologne clung to expensive things. She opened the wallet, a photograph, a business card, and a clean bill tucked into a corner. At the very bottom there was a slip of paper, the writing shaky and small. It read, "Sorry, my brother was hungry. I will pay back, I promise." The discovery belonged to Luis, who at 12 years old had the wide eyes of someone waiting for permission to be brave. He had dragged his younger brother Mateo to the counter to ask for a piece of bread. And Jane had been the one to hand over the loaf, partly out of habit, partly out of stubborn generosity. When the boys left, Maria followed them with a glance, and later saw them at the park seat, huddled together, Marcus' wallet forgotten at their feet. The choice the boys faced was simple and devastating at once. Maria found him and asked what happened. Mateo clutched his brother, and Louis whispered that he had taken a bill, but left a note because he could not go back and face the shopkeeper with empty hands. Maria held the small scribbled note between her fingers, and the paper trembled like a tiny flag of apology. The moment the owner of the wallet read the note became one of the pivots of the story. Marcus sat in his high-rise office, a place where decisions were carved into quarterly reports and the city lights looked like stars rented by numbers. He opened the wallet to check for cards to cancel and found the paper. He read it out loud, his voice small against the wall of glass he had built around himself, and something shifted. Honesty in a child's handwriting felt like a judgment. He thought about how the same city that had built him up also ignored small hungers. The paper might have been meaningless, except for the way it spoke in a voice that could not be bought. He remembered a childhood pocketbook with drawings and the face of his mother calling him to supper. His gaze traced the shaky letters, promise, and something like a human obligation lodged in him. If you were watching right now, and if your heart had already tightened reading the sentence on that paper, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what you would do if you found a wallet like that. Would you return it? Would you keep it? Would you leave only a note? Share a memory of a time a choice surprised you. Type "I would return" or "I would wait" and tell us why. Your words help other viewers see what choices look like in different lives. Your response matters to this story because it will shape the way people imagine what is possible, and your comment might inspire someone else to act with the same courage as the people in this tale. We read the community responses, and sometimes we return to the streets to find the people who left the stories you write and show how small acts ripple outward. So if this moved you, type your short reply now, and stay tuned, because what comes next will show how a returned wallet leads to a journey neither Marcus nor Jane expected. Jane decided to return the wallet herself because she could not stand the idea of someone like Marcus having something returned by a child who felt forced into an apology. She wiped her hands on her apron and took the thin piece of paper as a small map. She kept a pen under the counter in case someone wanted to write a note, and she wrote the address listed on the business card before stepping into the rain. The walk to Marcus Building was a passage from one life to another. She passed over the bridge where the river cut the city in two, smelled grease from food carts, and felt the rain soak her hair and shirt. Each step was a small negotiation with fear. At the lobby, security asked for identification, and a woman at the desk named Clara took the wallet and said a manager would handle it. Marcus was in a meeting, but his assistant, Thomas, called back that he would meet Jane in the lobby. When she met him, Marcus looked up surprised at the wet hair, the flour dust on her sleeve, the honest, bright look in her eyes. He held the wallet like an object that had been returned from a different hemisphere. Their first exchange was clumsy and real, with a sequence of words that belonged to two worlds. Jane said, "I found this on our stoop," and she handed the leather parcel. Marcus said, "Thank you, I did not realize it was missing." Jane said, "There was a note a child left," and she told him about Louis and Mateo. Marcus paused and said, "A child left a note? What did it say?" Jane read it aloud. "Sorry, my brother was hungry. I will pay back, I promise." Marcus said, "That is a small, monumental statement." Jane said, "They are on the park bench across the way, and they took bread and were sorry." Marcus asked, "Are they okay?" Jane said, "They looked thin, but they were smiling when they ate." Marcus said, "I would like to meet them." Jane hesitated and said, "They might be afraid, and I do not want to make things worse." Marcus said, "I understand, but maybe we could help, not shame." Jane said, "You are offering to help a stranger?" And Marcus said, "Sometimes money is a tool, but it is not the only answer." Jane said, "Then show me what you mean." And Marcus said, "All right, show me where you saw them." Across 3 short blocks, the city smelled of wet pavement and hot coffee, and as they walked, Marcus listened to Jane explain who frequented the bakery. She named Maria the baker, who kept the pastry case full, Rosa the dog, who slept under the table, and Mr. Thomas the retired teacher who always tipped in stories. She spoke about Louis, a boy who delivered papers, and Matteo, his little brother who hummed while he ate. Marcus asked questions that were unscripted. Where do they sleep at night? Where do they go when it rains? And Jane answered with a mixture of exactness and conjecture, saying they sometimes stayed at a shelter named Safe Harbor, and sometimes at Miss Rosa Place, who worked odd jobs. Along the way, Marcus introduced himself more formally and said his name Marcus Caldwell, and Jane said Jane Morales. And when he asked what she wanted, she said a fair chance for everyone to be treated like they mattered. One of the main moments of tension came under the old iron bridge, where the river narrowed and the wind came up like a verdict. Marcus had invited a small team, including Clara, his assistant, and a social worker named Esther, to meet Jane and the boys. The park felt exposed, the sky looked raw, and the first challenge was asking the boys to trust a man whose shoes were expensive and whose language spoke of other worlds.
Continents. Louis folded the note in his pocket and looked at Marcus. He said, "Why are you here?" And Marcus reached slowly and said, "I read your note. I want to offer help, not a favor." Then he offered a hand. Louis looked at his brother and then at Jane and Maria, who stood behind them, and took a measured breath. This scene of trust was fragile because the boys had known disappointment and promises that vanished like pennies in river water. The tension tightened when a man from another block shouted a warning about strangers, and the moment swayed toward flight. Marcus spoke plainly. "I will not take your freedom. I will help you find steady food, a place to sleep, and a school program. Will you let me try?" The boys whispered to each other, then accepted a small bag of sandwiches and a thermos of soup Marcus had arranged through Maria, and that first small warmth cracked the ice. The rescue moment that followed later that week happened by a bridge, and it became the scene people retold as if it were a single photograph. Louis had come to the bridge to meet a man who said he could get the boys work sweeping cars, but the man had other intentions. Marcus and Jane had been in the neighborhood checking whether the Safe Harbor shelter had beds available when a call from Clara came, a voice half panic, half urgent. Marcus and Jane ran toward the bridge and found Louis cornered by the stranger, heart pounding, hands clenched. There was an exchange of words, voices rising, and Marcus stepped forward to shield the boys. Security from Marcus, firm, and Jane's voice together created enough distraction to allow the police to arrive and take the man away. The immediate rescue was calming, and the boys were taken to the shelter and given blankets and food on site. This physical rescue carried a moral dimension because it proved that promise could be backed by action. A short medical sequence followed after the rescue when Matteo began to show signs of malnutrition. He had arrived pale with a cough, and the shelter called a pediatrician to assess. Dr. Patel examined him, noting low weight, dehydration, and a respiratory infection. The doctor prescribed a course of rehydration and vitamins and scheduled follow-up. The procedure in the clinic included a quick set of vitals, monitoring a weight check, and a nebulizer session to ease breathing. This technical care was given with attention and without judgment. The documentation was filed with the shelter, and referrals were made to a pediatric clinic for long-term follow-up. After the rescue and the medical check, Jane began spending more time with the boys at the shelter, and Marcus arranged provisional support, a fund for school supplies, and a small job program for Louis. Their lives folded together in ways that were both ordinary and extraordinary. There were mornings of coffee and homework, afternoons of trips to the library, and nights when Marcus would stand at the shelter doorway, looking uncertain and learning new rhythms. Marcus learned how to boil an egg properly and how to braid Matteo's hair for bed. He discovered small tasks that carried meaning, like sweeping the breakfast floor. Jane taught Marcus how to listen, not as a leader, but as a neighbor. She named the people in the shelter to him: Maria, the baker who had rallied donations; Rosa, the dog who sniffed out unused blankets; Esther, the social worker who pushed paperwork; and Thomas, the retired teacher who tutored. Marcus began to show up not because his name was attached to a program, but because he wanted to know the names and faces of the people who were teaching his city how to care. One of the long conversations between Jane and Marcus took place in the shelter kitchen, and it became a lesson in slow transformation. Jane said, "I have been tired of watching people make promises they do not keep, and I do not want pity." Marcus said, "I have been tired of buying solutions that feel like bandages." Jane said, "What do you want then?" And Marcus said, "To learn how to be present and to be useful." Jane laughed and said, "That is harder than any business deal." And Marcus agreed and said, "What if we start small? A class, a job, a consistent meal." Jane said, "Small becomes big if you keep it." And Marcus said, "Then keep it with me." They drafted plans that were not press releases. They were lists of practical steps to ensure school registration, to fund bus passes, and to secure a small apartment for short-term respite. A legal moment arrived when several agencies convened a hearing to decide temporary custody arrangements and to clarify the shelter's role. Judge Rivera presided and asked for a report from Esther, the social worker who had met the family. The judge listened with the weight of someone who had seen many versions of hardship. The hearing was structured. It began with testimony summaries from the shelter, the police report, and medical notes, then moved to closed sessions to ensure the boys' safety. The legal procedure included submission of a custody assessment, a review of the boys' home environment, and proposals for guardianship options. The format was formal, and the judge asked each adult present whether they were willing to be part of a plan that prioritized stability. Marcus offered to finance a guardianship plan that would allow him to support the boys while the system established long-term solutions, but he insisted he wanted collaboration, not control. Jane offered to be a consistent presence, and Maria agreed to continue support through the bakery. The judge concluded with a temporary guardianship arrangement that required regular reviews by a social worker and mandatory school enrollment, a decision that kept the boys with the shelter as they moved into more stable housing. A tension-filled segment during the hearing phase tested public perception and private motives. Critics in local media questioned Marcus' motives, saying a billionaire could not understand poverty and should not insert himself into court decisions. Marcus sat through articles and interviews where his generosity was framed as spectacle, and Jane sat at the shelter watching the way words could injure as much as help. The community debated on sidewalks, the arguments loud and the heat of judgment like summer air. Marcus confronted the reality that money could change resources but not erase history. Jane confronted the reality that trust is given slowly. Both learned that a public hearing would not settle private pains. Over weeks, the daily life of the boys stabilized. Mateo gained weight and his cough diminished. Louis began classes at a community center, and Marcus attended parent training sessions at the shelter. There were moments when the weight of difference pressed on them. For instance, when Marcus bought school uniforms and then learned to sew a badge onto a shirt by hand after it fell off in the wash. The small domestic scenes mattered more than the press because they built habit and credibility. Jane taught the boys to make biscuits like Maria, and Marcus taught them how to fold a small suit for interviews. Dr. Patel returned for checkups and smiled seeing the boys healthier. 3 months after the initial discovery, the group met again at the community center to sign a more permanent plan. Marcus had set up a small trust to pay for education and housing for the boys, while authorities worked on reunification with extended family members if appropriate. The social worker Esther had located an aunt in a neighboring city who expressed willingness to be involved but lacked proof of steady income. The plan placed both the boys in a shared program that combined schooling and therapy and mandated monthly reviews. The paperwork was technical and involved background checks, a financial plan, and a non-custodial guardianship clause that allowed Marcus to secure housing and finance services on behalf of the youths. This legal description took shape in plain terms to protect the boys' rights while providing practical support. By the end of 6 months, the visible changes were clear. Mateo had gained 3 kilograms. He laughed more and recited poems in class. Louis had stabilized at school, his attendance improved, and he took a small paid position at Maria's bakery, sweeping tables in exchange for a sandwich, a shift that gave him routine and dignity. Marcus had learned to set a regular time to check in with the shelter staff, not as a donor, but as a participant in a chain of care. Jane had been offered a position to coordinate community meals and had the support to take night classes. The neighborhood started to change subtly. Mothers spoke more openly on the benches, neighbors shared food, a small mutual aid box appeared by the park bench where the wallet had been found. An epilogue 1 month later showed immediate practical changes and small emotional repairs. 1 month later, Marcus visited the bakery and sat at the corner table watching Matteo draw maps while Luis shelved day-old pastries. He brought an envelope containing school supplies, which he handed to Maria, and she insisted on wrapping each pencil like a small charm. Jane had begun the night class on nonprofit management, and she told Marcus that the community meals program had 3 volunteers and a waiting list. The shelter reported that 5 families had accessed counseling and enrollment services and that the boys were attending school regularly. The stitches were still fresh but visible. 3 months later, a deeper pattern had formed. The trust Marcus created had paid for a tutor and for a program that connected the boys to extracurricular sports. Maria had partnered with a local grocer named Sam to deliver excess bread to the shelter, and Rosa the dog now had a small bed by the counter. There were more volunteer hours logged at the pantry, and the neighborhood association had scheduled monthly meetings where residents could voice needs. The aunt who had been located had completed background checks and was part of supervised visits. The boys had a plan toward reunification if it became viable, and if not, they had a network of adults committed to long-term stability. Marcus had shifted from being headline news to being a neighbor who sweeps the bakery floor sometimes after closing time. 6 months in, the transformation felt durable and complex. The boys had private rooms in a modest apartment paid by the trust Marcus had established and managed in collaboration with Esther and the shelter. Marcus had stepped back in public and supported a local nonprofit that hired Jane to run community engagement. Luis had begun an internship program at a local print shop arranged by Thomas the retired teacher, and Matteo enrolled in a music class funded by a community grant secured by Clara. The neighborhood calendar listed a back-to-school fair, and a small book exchange appeared in the park. The custody arrangement evolved into a legal guardianship with a review clause, and the judge commended the adults for their collaborative approach. People in the community began to tell the story not as a simple redemption, but as a collective effort that redefined responsibility. Marcus learned to hear neighbors not as metrics but as people, and Jane discovered that her small acts of care could multiply when they were combined with resources guided by humility. In the quiet, after the headlines faded, the core lesson remained simple and stubborn. A piece of paper inside an ordinary leather wallet had asked for honesty and had prompted a chain of human responses from a baker, a social worker, a doctor, a judge, and a billionaire who chose to listen. The city around them did what cities do. It kept changing, it kept asking for more care, and it kept rewarding the people who returned to their block with persistence. The transformation did not erase scars, but it opened a pathway where promises were matched with plans, where rescue was followed by education, and where custody became a conversation about belonging rather than ownership. If this story touched you, consider subscribing to hear more reports of lives that bend toward one another. If you were moved, write a short note in the comments, share what you would have done and why, and help others imagine how small acts can grow into systems of care. Stories like this remind us that honest gestures sometimes matter more than checks, and that a wallet and a note can start a long repair that turns strangers into neighbors. In the end, the most important thing was not the money, but the willingness to become part of a promise that held. The last image is of a small paper note folded into a pocket, a line written in a child hand that became the hinge for a city to open.